Welcome to this lecture, and this is a lecture that is following another lecture that I already gave, and the title of this lecture is Consequences of Being in Subordinate Group Status. So remember, the previous lecture was how subordinate group status persons or groups are created. So now, once they are created and they are existing, what are the consequences of being in that group? Let me say again, before I proceed, that even if I give examples from the United States or the examples we discuss are from the United States, this is an issue that goes beyond the United States. This is something that is documented in many different parts of the world. And by the way, this is true even in societies that were pre-colonial. And what I mean by pre-colonial, even before Europeans colonized, but it is not only Europeans that have colonized other places, there are also other people that have colonized. Even among Native Americans, there are some Native American groups that colonize others. So this is a general topic. I just want you to understand that, okay? So with that said, let's move on. And the first point I would like to make is when a social group has subordinate status, it encounters numerous social consequences. A good example of that, let me give you again, just to show you that this is not just an issue about the United States. When I was born, I encountered quite a lot of difficulty because, as I said much earlier, I'm an ethnic or religious minority. For bearing the name Samuel in the part of Nigeria that I come from, I've been asked several times why my name is Samuel, given the place where I come from, or something like that, okay? Now, under normal circumstances, it sounds strange that you are born in a particular place, you are raised there, you speak the language very fluently, but people are asking you questions about just your name, okay? So these are some of the kind of things that if you're a minority person, you begin to encounter sometimes. People ask you certain strange questions as if you come out of the zoo or something like that. And then second, some of the consequences are more devastating than others. So if somebody just maybe express some kind of surprise or something like that I'm bearing this name or something like that, like my name is Samuel or something like that, that's something else, okay? But it becomes worse when you are discriminated against. Okay, you are denied certain things that you are qualified or entitled to for no other reason but because of your minority status. This can be very, very painful, okay? It happened in Europe in the past. There are some Europeans who were discriminated within Europe itself. And it has happened in all regions of the world, okay? And then third, the consequences can be understood by situating them within particular social and historical context. So what I mean by this is, if you look at, for instance, the consequences of being a minority in the United States, for instance, 100 years ago, is different from the consequences of being a minority in the United States today, okay? There were a lot of things that were tolerated in terms of the way minority people were treated in the past. But today, if that was to happen, there would be a lot of reaction against that, okay? So just understand that there's a need to understand this in historical and social context. Okay, so what are the consequences of being in a subordinate group? One is extermination. Genocide is the extreme method that is used to eliminate subordinate group. And we know what genocide is, okay? So, and the examples of genocide are like the Nazi Holocaust, where a lot of Jewish people, millions of Jewish people were killed. And then in Rwanda, you remember how the Hutus decided to attack the Tutsis. And I think within 3 months, about 1 million people or so close to 1 million people were actually killed, okay? So you're just trying to eliminate people totally. That's what we call genocide. And then sometimes the subordinate group is forcefully deported using organized violence, and this is called ethnic cleansing. So ethnic cleansing is another consequence of being a minority, which means certain strategies are used by the dominant group to chase you out of a particular place totally. They don't want you there. They are not killing you, but we just don't want you here. Just leave, okay? Where are you going to go? Well, it's up to you. You can decide where you want to really go, okay? So ethnic cleansing is one example. And the subs for instance, tried to eliminate Muslims in Bosnia. That's another good example of that. The policies of white towards Native Americans in the 19th century is characterized by some scholars as a kind of genocide, because if you look at the way some of the wars, the words, the statements that were made by some of the colonizers in the United States, it's almost like the Native American is a primitive person or a barbarous person. They need to be just eliminated and things like that. So through warfare, disease, and forced relocation. And forced relocation is very important to note, because when these Native Americans were relocated, they were moved to certain environments that there were no provision there for them to survive. And so they end up just kind of suffering the consequences. And then if you are also interested in knowing more about extermination, native Aboriginal people in Australia also experienced genocide. But there was an apology for that in 2008 by the Australian government. So some people are apologizing for some of this extermination effort of the past. Okay, but this is one of the consequences you have if you are in the subordinate group. Let me just quickly say before we move to the next theme that the issue here is about power. If two people or two groups have equal amount of power, there's no way one can commit genocide easily against the other. So don't forget about power. It's only when you have power over the other person that you can just treat them anyhow and decide to engage in ethnic cleansing, or you just commit, you try to exterminate them through genocide. Okay. Genocide is an extreme example, or extermination is an extreme example. The next example we have, or the process through which subordinate people kind of like suffer the consequences of being in that group, is expulsion. The dominant group can force a subordinate group to move out of a certain area or even expel them from the country. Okay? You just expel them because you don't need them anymore. And this has happened in many parts of the world. You don't need people because they are either a minority or something like that. And you remember the Jewish people also equally suffered this in some European countries. Native Americans were drove out of their traditional territory or tribal land. And in 2009, there's a group of people called the Roma. I don't know whether people know about the Roma, but the Roma are people who live in Europe, but they are traditionally people of Indian ancestry. So they live in Europe, but they look somewhat dark in their skin color. So many of them were living in France, and France didn't like them or whatever, and they tried to expel them or move them out of the country. It became a huge embarrassment for the French government. And then the French government was warned by the European Union that this will not be tolerated. And then the French government tried to give an excuse that, well, we're not expelling them or forcing them out because they are Roma and they are dark skinned or something like that, but we're doing that because they are just living in places that are not supposed to be places where people live, so illegal camps, okay? So this is the second way that somebody can suffer the consequences of being a subordinate. You can be expelled from wherever you are, okay? Now let's move to the third. Secession. A subordinate group can break away and form its own nation, or it can move to another nation and become a dominant group. So secession, as you can see here, it can happen in two ways. The subordinate group can break away and join like you move from this part of the country, one country, and then you join another, okay? And I think there was a time when Quebec wanted to break away from Canada or something like that, but it didn't work. A good example of this is British departure from Israel in 1948. You remember Israel used to be like under the control of the British or whatever. When the British moved, then the Israelites just decided to take over Palestinians or whatever, and we're still struggling with this issue up to now. So you can see the change of the change in the situation there. When the British were there, the Israelites themselves were subordinated to the British. But then when the British left, now the Israelites became the powerful, and then the Palestinians then became on the margins. And then you remember also Pakistan used to be part of India. And then when because of religious differences, Pakistani people are Muslims, but Indians, majority of them are Hindu. Pakistan decided to secede from India, and then they formed their own country, which is now the Islamic Republic of Pakistan. And then throughout the 20th century, minority groups have tried to abandon dominant nations for their own customs, which means secession. So you remember when the Soviet Union, Union of Soviet Republic, it was very diverse. It brought quite a lot of nations together to form the Union of Soviet Republic. But once the Soviet Union collapsed, then countries like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, etc., all kind of like left and formed their own countries. They may be small, but they wanted to restore their own cultural identity, so they left. Okay. And one of the reasons why they left, which I want to really emphasize here, is they do not want to be tolerated. And I want to emphasize this. If you are living around me and I tell you that I'm just tolerating you, you're not going to feel happy about that. You're not going to feel happy because I'm making you feel like you are not really appreciated or something like that. You're just squatting or something like that. So people prefer to be where they will be free. And you see this in the history of Native Americans, because the Native Americans did not want to be part of this civilization that was created by Europeans, but they will be tolerated. They will rather move west to an empty space sometimes where they will be free to move. And people did not seem to understand what the Native Americans were up to. But that's the point. They do not want to feel like, I'm living here, but you're tolerating me. No, if you're tolerating me, it means like I'm a nuisance to you. Okay? And then some African Americans have called for secession from the United States. Now, if you study the history of African Americans, you find out that, for instance, the Nation of Islam has called for the creation of a whole state within the United States just made for black people. And then you remember the American Colonization Society also, which at that time, some people believe that the black people cannot fit into the new civilization that is being created in this country. So the best thing is to either create a country for them in Central America or somewhere in Latin America, or move them to Africa. And that's how Liberia came into existence. The fourth way that a subordinate group can suffer consequences of being subordinate is segregation. In other words, if you are a subordinate group in the larger group, you are going to suffer segregation. You will be segregated. Segregation, which is physical separation, can be manifested in the form of where people leave their workplace and social activities and functions. Now, you should be already familiar with this, that there was segregation in the United States after Reconstruction. We had Jim Crow, which simply means that blacks and white are going to live in different neighborhoods. They go to different churches. They go to different schools. If they're in the bus, the blacks would have to go behind and all those kind of things, okay? So this is all example of segregation. In the workplace, there are certain places that, even in the military at one point, they insisted that the blacks had to be in different platoons or things like that, separate platoons instead of being mixed with white. Later on, this will change, but there was a time this was the case. So segregation can manifest itself even in church. And I want to say a little bit about church. I know some people would not like to hear this, but sometimes when you think about that, when churches existed and there was this segregation, was it the Holy Spirit that was telling the churches that people will be segregated or not? And if now we don't tolerate segregation, for instance, is it like the Holy Spirit sent a new message that it didn't send at that time or something like that? So now what I'm trying to draw your attention to, which is a problem that exists in all human societies, is that sometimes even people know the religious truth, they probably would use their social and material interests to do something that is wrong. And they will just claim that it is religious or something like that, okay? So because segregation was really a serious problem in America. You remember Martin Luther King Jr. said, the 11th hour on Sunday is the most segregated hour in America. And by that he meant the 11th hour on Sunday is when people go to church, and people go to church along racial lines in America. That was what he was trying to say. And this is still, by the way, probably true today in the United States. Okay, although there are churches that are integrated, but the percentage is very small. Okay, segregation is often demanded by the group that is dominant against the group that is subordinate. It is, however, never total. So what does this mean? So generally, it is the dominant groups that wants to be segregated. They see themselves as a special class, as a special breed. So we don't want to have any they do not want to have any interaction with people who come from the lower class or from the subordinate group or something like that. So they are the people who demand segregation. Generally, the subordinate group do not demand segregation. Actually, they will demand inclusion most of the time. But unfortunately, this is not what they really get. So, and this whole idea of being special, like I am special, and because I am special, I'm up here at the top of the pyramid, you're at the bottom, and I don't want to have anything to do with you. This is a problem that exists in all human societies, and there are different reasons why people think they really want that. But as I said, segregation is not total. It is not total because even in South Africa, where just like we have the Native Americans put into reservations, there too in South Africa, black people were put into some kind of native homelands or something like that. So when they have permit, they can leave their community and go to the city and work where the white people really live. But then when they finish, they have to come back and stay at their base. And remember that when they go to the city, they have to carry like an ID card or permit to show that they have permission to be in the city, because otherwise the city is not meant for them. They're supposed to be at their base. Okay, so it means when they go to work, at least they interact with white people. But the idea, that's why we say the segregation is not really total. Now, Douglas Massey and Nancy Dayton documented segregation in the U.S. based on U.S. cities data in 1990 and wrote a book titled American Apartheid. And when they did that, they found out that neighborhood segregation in the U.S. is similar to residential segregation in South Africa, kind of, okay? And the other thing they also find out is that in spite of increased diversity of people in the U.S., and laws making segregation illegal, they concluded that segregation is still persisting. Okay? So remember that so many laws have been passed in the area of housing, Brown versus Board of Education, about desegregating schools or whatever. But if you look around today, you're going to find out that segregation has persisted. Some of the schools are probably even as segregated as they were before. Why? Now, here you have to make a distinction between de jure segregation and de facto segregation. So, de jure segregation simply means by law, segregation by law. There was a time we had segregation in this country where the law is there that says that you can't sell a house to a black person in this neighborhood. Black people cannot get mortgage loan from Federal Housing Authority to buy a house, this and that. Okay, this was how suburbanization took place in the United States. When they were suburbanizing the country way back after the Second World War, they made sure that only white people got the loan, but minority people, even those that were veterans, did not get the loan, because the idea was to suburbanize America, but to suburbanize it in a very white way. Okay? So this was by law. But today we don't have any law like that in the United States, but we still have segregation. This is what we call de facto segregation. De facto segregation takes place as a result of the natural functioning of society. Okay? So there's a neighborhood in the Twin Cities, for those of you who do not know, it's called Minnetonka. Now, given the income I make, even if I want to live in Minnetonka, I cannot afford to live in Minnetonka. You have to make certain amount of money. Okay? So the income people make has become an indirect way of segregation. Even if you want to buy a house in certain neighborhood, you cannot afford that. And generally, not all cases, but not in all cases, but in most cases, minority people tend to have lower income. So even if they want to be in certain neighborhoods, they cannot afford to do that because they just do not have the money or the status to afford buying a house in that area. So that ends up creating segregation, not because there's something in the law that says this should happen, but it is the market that sorts us out. There are certain restaurants that I cannot afford to go and eat, okay, because it's just too expensive, okay? I have to choose the kind of restaurant that I would go and eat. And so generally people of lower income or moderate income would go to certain restaurants, and people of higher income can go to the most expensive restaurant if they choose to, because they can afford it. So the de facto segregation we have today in the United States is very difficult to deal with. Why? Because it is based on the functioning of the economic system. It sorts us out. If you try to do something against that, it's going to upset many people. They are going to say that either you're trying to call for a revolution, or this is socialism, or something like that. So we do not know where this is heading us, where we're heading with this, but that's something that is really a fact. Okay? Now, and by the way, let me just add to say that this segregation that they talk about, if you look at it very carefully, you will find out that while in one way you can talk about segregation between, say, whites and Latinx and Asian Americans and black people, but when you look at it really very carefully, you will find out that within the black community, within the Asian American community, and within the Latinx community, you still find some degree of segregation there, because this segregation is based on income, okay? So those black people or those Asian American people who can afford, you will find out that they are also living in some area where only people who have the money, who can afford to buy houses in that area, are there. And then the other people within that group, whether Asian American or Latinx or black, who cannot afford, they are also in another part. So there's a way in which the logic of the economy can bring segregation, not just between whites and the other, but it can also bring segregation within each of the minority groups, which makes it so complicated. Okay, African Americans experience the highest residential segregation. I think this should not be surprising. So given the history of the United States, even though the Hispanics and the Asian Americans experience segregation, but their segregation is not as high as that of the black community. So even when we consider social class, the patterns of minority segregation persist. So what does this mean? What this is saying is that even if I have the income like another white person, you are going to find out that still there are certain factors beside my income that are going to make it difficult for me to move to certain neighborhoods. Okay? So that's what they are really talking about. So it's not just even a question of money. And the Native Americans continue to be segregated as they live in their reservations. So living in the reservation that many Native Americans, not all of them, but many still experiencing, is kind of something that helps them to maintain their identity. But on the other hand, when you think about it, the opportunities they have in life is not like those who live in the city and have acquired the necessary education, the skills that are needed in order for you to be employed. Remember that when you live in a capitalist economy, for you to be employed, you have to be a value addition to the business or to the organization. If you're not going to be a value addition to any business organization, they are not going to employ you, because it is a capitalist economy and they're not going to just waste. This is true not just in the United States, but anywhere. If you're really looking at or looking for an efficient market economy, you can't employ just people just because you like them. They have to have some skills that would be a value addition to the organization. And then records indicate that this resegregation has been thriving, and this time around, not only neighborhoods, but even schools after it declined for some time. I've already mentioned about it, which is based on the research by Massey and the Denton, which is saying that they look at the data in 1990, and there was a time after the 1960s when they passed all the Civil Rights Act, Fair Housing Act, and things like that, which Brown versus Board of Education, which reduced segregation, but gradually now segregation has also even increased. So the result is many influential and powerful white men grow without ever having close interaction with people from other ethnic groups. So what does this mean? What we're saying here is just that we're not trying to just single out white people, okay? But if you go to, say, for instance, any country where there's a dominant group of people, when there's segregation, you will find many of these people from the dominant group growing up, but they never have the opportunity to interact with anybody from one of the subordinate groups, okay? So what I mean by that is, because in this country, like in the United States, white people are powerful, okay? They are very influential. So if they at least have an experience of the life of somebody very close to them or whatever that they know who is a minority, it can help them if they are in position of authority to say, well, I am here to make decisions, but I have had experience interacting with somebody like this closely, and it helps me understand what we are really talking about here. Okay, so that's the reason why we are talking about this. So this can happen when you go to any Latin American country or African country or Asian country. If there's a dominant group there, and members of the dominant group never have an opportunity to interact closely with somebody from the subordinate group, then when they're in position of power and they have to make decisions, they will just make decisions in a biased manner. That's what we're really talking about here. So in the United States, it's not surprising sometimes to find somebody who is a white person, maybe in their 50s or 60s, but maybe they have never had any 15 minutes or 20 minutes conversation with a person from a subordinate group. Now, if such a person is in position of authority to make a decision that would affect all people, that's when it becomes a matter of concern because they have no any exposure. Okay, so that's segregation. That's another consequences of being a subordinate. The next one, the fifth one, is fusion. Fusion, this is a situation where because of inter-group interaction and ethno-cultural or racial group emerges that synthesizes elements from each of the other groups. So what that simply means is just like, let me give you a quick example, like you have different colors in water or something like that in watery form, and then you combine them all in one container, and then you mix it up. When you mix the colors, what is going to emerge is going to be a totally different color. It will neither be blue, nor white, nor brown or something. It will be a totally new color. So that's what we mean by fusion. In the history of the United States, the term that comes close to fusion is called melting pot. A melting pot is where there has been some interaction, fusion between all these different ethnic groups, that a new identity has been created that is neither white, it's neither black, it's neither Asian, it's neither Latinx or whatever. It's something totally new. Now, if you remember, for those of you who have studied Western humanities, when Alexander the Great created the Hellenistic Empire, he encouraged his soldiers to marry the indigenous people of the places where he had colonized or he had conquered. Why? He said, if there's intermarriage between these soldiers, okay, and the indigenous people, a time is going to come when there will be no distinction between the conqueror and the conquered. They will all be fused to become one person. And he thought that was a new vision for creating some kind of new identity. So I just want you to understand that the melting pot we're talking about here was something that somebody like Alexander the Great thought about it, okay? And this happens, of course, through marriage and things like that. But remember that in the United States, there's some resistance to interracial marriage. I believe it was only in 1967 that interracial marriage became approved in this country. Otherwise, prior to that, it was not approved. Now, I'm talking here about the legal approval. If you think about it, even if it is legally approved, there are some people who frown against that. Okay, let's move on to point number 6, assimilation. So another option with another consequence that subordinate groups suffer is assimilation. So what is assimilation? Assimilation is when subordinate or minority groups adopt the characteristics and culture of the group that is dominant as means for the group to be accepted. Okay? So to just give you an idea, it's like you abandon your own culture if somebody is a subordinate person, and then you adopt the culture of the majority or the dominant group. Okay? Now, there's a limit to how far you can assimilate. And there are different kinds of assimilation too. Let me talk about 2. Structural assimilation. Structural assimilation is when somebody speaks and you know that this person was not born in the United States. They probably immigrated into this country. But the person is well integrated into an organization, maybe a corporation, maybe a higher institution, maybe a business organization. They function very well. Everybody understands what they are trying to do or whatever. So that's what we call structural. They fit into the structure of the society. They can function really very well, okay? But that is not cultural assimilation. Cultural assimilation simply means this person might immigrated, but they have adapted so well. They have adapted so well into the dominant culture that you cannot even recognize them. Their mannerism, their everything sounds like that of the dominant group. Quick example to give you here to illustrate this. I listen to the British Broadcasting Corporation very, very much on the radio. And you hear a lot of these people speaking with typical British accents, okay? And normally I would think like they are white people. And then when I see them sometimes on TV, I realize that the person is actually originally Pakistani or Indian, okay? But their mannerism and everything is British. So this is an example of cultural assimilation. Somebody may look in appearance different, but in terms of their mannerism, the way they think or whatever, they have fit in it really very well, okay? So assimilation means the subordinate groups conform to the dominant or majority culture. Now, there's a tension here. If you tell all immigrants to abandon everything about their own culture and assimilate so that they just conform to everything about the dominant culture, this can be a problem. Why? Because generally, not only in America, but everywhere, if there's a dominant culture, there's a tendency, as we covered in another lecture when we talk about institutional racism, there's a way in which the dominant group in every society tries to codify some of its vision of the world in the law or something like that. So when you are abandoning your culture as a subordinate person to embrace or to assimilate into the culture of the dominant group, sometimes you may be assimilating into certain ideas or culture that views you as somebody subordinate or somebody inferior. So you're almost becoming part and parcel of the system that really oppresses you, okay? Now, the assumption is that the majority group members will pursue this with, or the minority group members will pursue this with enthusiasm, and they will also be incorporated without hesitation into the dominant group. Okay, two things here. The assumption of assimilation is that the minority group or the subordinate group will try to assimilate into the dominant culture with all enthusiasm. And there's also an assumption that the dominant group is willing and its hands, or the cultural group is open, its hands are open just to kind of assimilate anybody that comes. But history shows that this is not necessarily true. First, there are a lot of minority groups that would like to assimilate, okay? But there's a limit to how far they can assimilate. If somebody immigrated to the United States when they are in their 40s or their 50s, whatever, how can they really turn to become typically like really American? There's something that they bring, maybe the way they talk or whatever, their mannerism, that would still show that there's something different about them. So even if they intend to assimilate, there's a limit to how far they can go, okay? But the other side is that even if you are willing to assimilate, it still remains whether the dominant culture is going to accept you. And if you check the history of this country, I remember reviewing documentary films, you see how in the southern part of the United States, many black people will dress just regularly in the town. They will dress with suit, they will wear a hat and over, looking really very professional, whatever. All they were trying to do was, please look at me and accept me as a normal person. But that did not make the system to really assimilate them. So even if you are willing to assimilate, it depends on the powerful group to decide whether they are going to assimilate you or not. And I think I mentioned much earlier in one lecture that this is the reason why Native Americans decided to refuse to submit to or be incorporated into this new pyramid that was created by Europeans. Europeans thought they brought civilization. So they wanted to incorporate the Native Americans so that they will civilize them, so they want Native Americans to assimilate. But Native Americans realized that if we accept, we are going to be put at the bottom of the pyramid, and we don't have control on how fast we move up. It depends on the powerful people to decide whether they want to move us up or not. So they ran away, okay? So people may not understand that, but this is really the issue. Now, because we are running out of time, I just want to make an important point. I think I've said a lot about what assimilation is. So the point I'm trying to make here is the debate around assimilation. And this is something that I think I can share with you my own personal experience so that you don't think this is just something academic. But the idea is that if any society is going to function very effectively, all societies need some degree of value and cultural consensus in order to remain cohesive. Their mores and folkways are necessary. Mores and folkways are necessary. What we mean by mores and folkways is the common sense of what it means to live in a culture. That's what mores and folkways are. So the point I'm trying to make here, or the debate, is that I don't think when you look at the way societies really function really very well, if you're honest with yourself, you can say that, well, forget about assimilation. Assimilation is not necessary. Well, if we don't have anything that we share as cultural values or consensus, whether in the United States, whether in the world, whether in Britain or China or Japan, how can we really operate as a community? Okay? So we have to take the question of assimilation seriously. But the question is, to what extent do we have that kind of assimilation, okay? Like, are we talking about everybody speaking like an American? And remember that there are about 14 different accents of American English, just American English. So if I'm going to assimilate to learn any of those accents, which one am I going to learn? Is it the Southern accents? Is it the California? Is it the East Coast or the African American accent? You understand the point I'm trying to make. So there are different accents of American English. So the point is, for us to live as a society, there has to be some degree of consensus, and that's where assimilation becomes relevant. If I join an organization, I want to work in that organization. Even if I do not agree with everything, there has to be some basic agreement I have with the organization in order for me to function very well. So similarly, if I move to China today and I want to work and succeed in China, I have to understand that I'm Chinese society and I have to learn to adapt to that Chinese culture. Now, of course, I may not be able to become a Chinese, but I still have to adapt. So I think there's some truth to the fact that we need assimilation, some degree of assimilation in every society, because when we share certain norms in common, our mores and folkways, certain values, it helps us function effectively as a society. But I leave the rest for you to decide about how much assimilation do we really need. But I don't think it is a wise idea to just say that we're just going to throw away the idea of assimilation totally because it is about the dominant group trying to control the minority group. Okay, and then the concluding part of this discussion is going to be on alternative to assimilation, which is the pluralist perspective. So what is pluralism, or what is pluralism in this respect? Mutual respect between the various groups in a society for one another's culture, allowing minorities to express their own culture without experiencing prejudice or hostility. And I think, so pluralism simply means minority groups are able to express maybe their traditional dance, right? They have different kinds of traditional dance. 2 weeks ago, I was invited to the Gambian community, and they had a celebration, and I saw some of this traditional dance or whatever, and it was in a rented public place, and it's fine. It didn't affect anybody or whatever. They are still Americans, but they were able to still experience that, okay? So that's pluralism. And I saw some white people who came there just to see it and just kind of like appreciate this another cultural experience. So I am a person of African ancestry, but I don't have any problem if you say there's traditional Scottish dance, there's traditional this kind of dance, European dance. I don't have any problem with that because it's part of the human experience. The problem is when somebody tells you that unless you can do this kind of dance, you are less than human, then that becomes a totally different conversation, okay? So pluralism is where you allow all these different cultural manifestations to exist. Okay, so there's a commitment to maintaining diversity of ethnic groups instead of eliminating them. I think that's fine. The Minnesota Humanities Center has a program where minority groups in the state of Minnesota apply for grant, and it's maximum of $20,000, and they are allowed to use it to do something that would help them maintain their cultural heritage. Now, at some point, I participated in that kind of grant assessment. And one of the points I made, which is general, and I'm willing to say it anywhere, is that, yes, I want these people, especially for myself being an immigrant, I want them to be able to maintain their cultural heritage. But I also said that they have to create something that would help them connect with other minority groups and then with mainstream American culture. Why? Because the children of many of these immigrants are not going to go back to their countries. They are going to be here. So if they are going to be here, and even some of the adults are not going back to their country of origin, they are going to be here. So if you're going to be here, one thing that is important in terms of your success is not just maintaining your cultural heritage, but also adapting, learning to adapt. When you learn to adapt, it helps you make transition from just what you originally are to what you are becoming in this new culture. And we have known that the groups that have been very, very successful in the United States, immigrant groups, are groups that have not just decided to remain in an enclave, keeping their cultural heritage, but they also try to adapt to mainstream American culture so that they can function very effectively. So this approach recognizes the need for and importance of shared cultural values, beliefs, ideas, mores, and folkways. So what we're trying to say here is that if you're going to have pluralism in a society, if you have pluralism without shared values, without shared beliefs, ideas, mores, and folkways, sometimes you're just going to be fighting each other. So in spite of all this diversity, there has to be a core where we all agree upon. Because if there's no core beliefs or values that we agree upon, then we're always just going to be fighting each other, and we will be unpredictable towards each other. And then pluralism allows a lot of freedom and space for variation in cultural expression and coexistence, which I have also explained. Okay. I think I would just like to conclude this by just saying that there are today many groups that are part of the dominant group in the United States, but are now trying to recover their own identity, which is something very interesting. There used to be a time when they don't care, but now they are really very concerned about that. And then finally, we are seeing pluralism in America exists or manifesting itself even in the language that people are using and in how funeral homes conduct burial. And what I mean by that is that there was a time when funeral homes only have ways of conducting funeral that are based on mainstream American culture. But now if you go to many of the funeral homes, they have come up with ways of adapting. Okay, this person is from this cultural group, so this is how they do their own burial or something, which all indicates that America is really kind of like adapting. So to conclude, what I just want to say is that pluralism is really very good, but we can't ignore this question of having shared values, certain beliefs. They're very, very important, because without that, the society can tear apart. Thank you very much.